Discrimination is something that is still an issue in our society today, and in the past, it was an even worse issue. African Americans have been discriminated against since they arrived in America. Before the 19th century, most African Americans had very few rights, and the large majority of them were slaves. African men, women, and children were brought to America and sold in the slave trade. They were seen as property, and they were not treated well by their owners. After slavery was abolished by 1900, the South was Jim Crowed, which essentially meant that segregation was common. There were laws against segregation, but they were not obeyed, and African Americans were treated as if they were non-citizens. Even though African Americans were technically free in the 20th century, they still dealt with extreme discrimination and cruelty. Thankfully, in the 1960s, the civil rights movement succeeded in outlawing legalized racial segregation and discrimination. Before the civil rights movement, it was also possible for a restrictive covenant to be put on property. This meant that it was possible to exclude a person or persons of a designated race or color from owning or occupying a property. The Shelleys, an African American family, purchased a home in St. Louis, Missouri in 1945. They were unaware that there was a restrictive covenant on the house. A restrictive covenant is a clause in a deed or lease to a property that limits what the owner of the land or lease can do with the property. Restrictive covenants allow surrounding property owners who have similar covenants in their deeds to enforce the terms of the covenant in a court of law. At one time, they were used to prevent minorities from moving into residential neighborhoods. A group of homeowners would agree not to sell or rent their homes to African Americans, Jews, and other minorities by including this restriction in their deeds. The property that the Shelleys bought had a restrictive covenant on it since 1911 that prevented anyone who was Asian or African American from living there. A resident sued to prevent the Shelleys from living there. The Supreme Court ruled that private agreements to exclude persons or designated race or color from the use or occupancy of real estate for residential purposes does not violate the 14th Amendment. It does violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment for state courts to enforce them. The court found that racially based restrictive covenants are not themselves unconstitutional, but private parties may voluntarily adhere to them. But state enforcement of such covenants, including judicial action, would be discriminatory and would therefore violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Even though it is unconstitutional to take judicial action against the violation of a restrictive covenant, there are still other ways to continue to support racial discrimination in housing today. In 2012, there were 28,519 complaints about housing discrimination in our country, and this is an increase since 2011. This shows that even though we have come so far, housing discrimination is still an issue that needs to be addressed. There are even still instances that have been brought to trial in today's society. One example is the HUD versus Lawrence Properties. Charges were issued against the managers of Heritage Point Mobile Home Park in Montgomery, Alabama, because the employees carried out the CEO's discriminatory preferences by refusing to look at applications submitted by African Americans who wanted to live in the mobile home park. This goes against the Fair Housing Act because it is a policy put in place to prevent a certain group of people from occupying a property, and it is very similar to the restrictive covenants that were put in place in the past. Cases like this show that racism and discrimination were an issue in the past, and there has been things done to eliminate discrimination in today's society. Even though discrimination is not as much of an issue as it was in the past, it is still a prevalent issue today. Society needs to realize that racism is not a thing of the past. It is still here today, and it needs to be acknowledged in order for it to change and have everyone in our country, regardless of race or ethnicity, truly be equal.